Hello everyone, tonight we're talking about something that shouldn't make sense but absolutely does. How people sleeping in animal skins inside cone-shaped tents on the frozen Great Plains were somehow warmer than most of us are in our heated apartments. From families using buffalo hides thicker than a tax code, to fire pits engineered better than most modern chimneys, to the unspoken art of sleeping so close together that personal space became theoretical. This is the story of how primitive housing turned out to be better climate control than most of civilization ever managed. We'll see why snow was used as insulation, how dried buffalo dung became a luxury heating fuel, and why the soft glow of firelight inside those tipis created not just warmth but sanity, a psychological fortress against an entire world made of ice. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy slow-burning stories about human brilliance, cold air, and questionable fire safety. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Somewhere warm, I hope. Now, dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket close, or just sit by whatever artificial fire you've got. Tonight, we're going back to a world that should have frozen but didn't, because inside those tipis, when the fire glowed and the wind howled, warmth wasn't a luxury. It was a science, a prayer, and sometimes a family's last beautiful secret. It's a funny thing about human beings. They seem to spend centuries inventing new ways to make themselves uncomfortable. Central heating, for example, which dries your skin, burns your nose, and leaves you sweating in January. Meanwhile, centuries ago, in the middle of the Great Plains, where winter could freeze the eyelashes off a buffalo, people somehow managed to stay warm inside animal skins, stretched over sticks. No thermostats, no insulation, no smug, energy-efficient rating, just fur, fire, and a profound understanding of how not to die at minus 30 degrees Celsius. The plains in winter weren't picturesque, they were merciless. Winds came like punishment, sweeping through endless grass that turned brittle and white. The kind of landscape where even ghosts would have worn layers. Yet inside the circular world of a tipi, there was warmth, real warmth, the kind that doesn't hum through wires, but breathes with you. Outside, the stars looked like shattered bone across a black sky. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, hides, and sleep. The irony, of course, is that the tipi looked fragile, a cone of poles and hides, as if one ambitious gust might peel it apart. But the design was older than doubt. It was aerodynamic before the Wright brothers were born. Wind didn't hit a tipi. It slipped around it, like water around a stone. And unlike houses that stand stubborn and still, a tipi leaned slightly into the wind, yielding just enough to survive. The plains people, Lakota, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, Crow, didn't live in tents. They lived inside small masterpieces of climate engineering. At night, when the cold pressed against the world like a slow beast, families gathered inside their tipis and lit the fire. The flames climbed toward the smoke hole at the top, a small dark mouth open to the sky. The heat rose, the hides held it, and the entire structure pulsed like a living heart. There was no draft, no frostbitten toes. The air shimmered with warmth and breath, and the faint hum of survival. What kept them warm wasn't just physics, it was cooperation. The fire demanded constant tending, the hides needed adjusting. The smoke hole flaps had to be aligned with the wind. It was a nightly choreography between humans, wood, and weather. Each spark was a negotiation with the cold. And as they sat cross-legged around the fire, shadows painting their faces in bronze and black, the idea of home wasn't defined by walls or roofs. It was defined by the space where the fire's light touched. If you had stepped inside one of those tipis, you would have found no wasted space, no useless ornamentation, and certainly no place to be alone. The circular layout made sure of that. Every sound, the crackle of embers, the sigh of someone settling under a robe, a child turning in sleep, became part of the same pulse. Warmth, in that world, wasn't a matter of temperature, it was a matter of proximity. The plains people didn't conquer the cold, they outwitted it. While the rest of humanity was building castles that trapped drafts and frozen egos, these nomads were crafting sanctuaries that breathed with the earth. The tipi wasn't a house, it was a philosophy stitched in buffalo hide, proof that warmth doesn't come from walls, but from knowing how to live with the wind rather than against it. And that's where it begins, a night in the middle of nothing, the cold pressing down like stone, and inside, a cone of light holding against the dark. It's here that the secret unfolds, not in the fire itself, but in the way the smoke finds its way out, as if the structure itself knows how to survive the season. It's one of those things that looks too simple to be intelligent. A few poles, some hides, a circle in the snow. But that's the point. True genius often comes disguised as common sense. The tipi wasn't built to impress anyone. It was built to keep people alive when even wolves thought twice about going outside. Every angle, every seam, every inch of smoke-stained hide was a quiet piece of engineering brilliance. The kind of brilliance that never wrote itself into history books because it was too busy surviving. The entire structure began with the poles, long, straight lodgepole pines, stripped smooth and seasoned in the sun. Each one was chosen for flexibility, not strength. The plains people knew what modern architects keep forgetting. Rigid things break. A tipi bends. It sways. It takes a punch from the wind and laughs it off. 12 to 20 poles, arranged in a cone, rising together and crossing at the top. An act of geometry performed by memory, not math. No blueprints, no tape measures, no nervous engineers with clipboards, just hands, instinct, and weather sense. Then came the hides, buffalo, thick and heavy as loyalty. Women were the architects of warmth, their work measured in stitches and patience. They scraped, tanned, and smoked each hide until it was soft but tough, then stitched them edge to edge into a great semicircle. When wrapped around the pole frame, it became a single, continuous skin, fitted with the precision that modern tents would kill for. The seams overlapped against the wind, like scales on a breathing creature, and because the hides were slightly oily, they repelled water, snow, and most bad moods. The cover didn't just hang, it could be adjusted, rolled up at the base in summer, dropped low and sealed tight in winter. The entire thing could be assembled or dismantled in less than an hour, and if a storm was coming, that mattered. This was portable architecture before the age of wheels and caravans, a home that could move with the herds and reappear wherever the land allowed. Inside, the design created layers of temperature. The cone shape meant that warm air rose to the top and circulated downward, while the slanted walls pushed cold air to the edges. The floor was lined with hides, robes, and woven mats that trapped heat close to the ground. The result wasn't just shelter from the wind, it was a thermal ecosystem. Even the doorway had purpose. It faced east, greeting the morning sun, not by accident, but by cosmology. Each sunrise warmed the entrance, burned off the frost, and aligned daily life with celestial rhythm. You could say that tipi was the earliest form of solar architecture, but that would ruin the poetry of it. There was something almost defiant in the way this tent outperformed stone houses built with centuries of ego. It could stand through storms that would flatten a cabin and still look graceful about it. From the outside, it seemed small, but from within, the space expanded with the light of the fire, the breath of people, and the sound of life continuing through impossible cold. The tipi was a contradiction, delicate in appearance, indestructible in practice. It didn't fight the wind, it partnered with it. It didn't trap heat, it circulated. It didn't separate humans from nature. It reminded them they were part of it. And when the night deepened and the first flickers of smoke rose through the central hole, you could almost believe the whole thing was breathing, exhaling warmth into the stars. And that breath, that perfect exchange between smoke, air, and fire, was no accident. It was the next secret in the long architecture of survival. Every culture has its misunderstood masterpiece. The Greeks had philosophy, the Romans had plumbing, and the plains tribes had a hole in the roof. At first glance, the smoke hole looked like a design flaw, an open wound in an otherwise perfect shelter. But this little gap at the top of the tipi was a miracle of physics disguised as a vent. It kept people alive through winters that could freeze water mid-air, and it did so without a single blueprint, patent, or instruction manual. The smoke hole worked because the entire structure was built to breathe. Fire in the center heated the air, and hot air rises. That's the part every schoolchild knows. But inside a tipi, this process became a form of art. As warmth climbed, it carried smoke upward to the opening, where it escaped like a spirit, slipping between worlds. Cooler air was drawn in near the ground, feeding the fire and refreshing the air inside. The result, circulation constant, quiet, perfect. Not a hint of carbon monoxide poisoning, not a whisper of stale air. And here's where it gets clever. The hole wasn't just a hole. It came with adjustable flaps to ears of hide that could be moved with long poles from inside. If the wind shifted, the flaps shifted too, guiding smoke away and redirecting the draft. Tilt them one way, you invited heat to linger. Tilt them another, and you summoned a breeze. It was, effectively, a Bronze Age thermostat, one that required balance, experience, and a good sense of which direction the gods were currently blowing from. When storms swept the plains, those same flaps became shields. The wind might roar and tear at the hides, but inside, the fire stayed steady. The smoke rose straight, and life continued. It was almost rude how well it worked. European settlers, building box-shaped houses with chimneys that smoked them half to death, used to look at Tipis and think primitive. The irony, of course, is that the primitive system solved problems modern houses still struggle with: ventilation, moisture, heat loss. The Tipis smoke hole didn't just release smoke, it managed balance. At night, when the flames burned low and the cold pressed closer, that small opening above became a fragment of sky, a reminder that even in warmth, there was connection to what lay beyond it. Smoke curled through the aperture, glowing orange for a moment before disappearing into blackness. The line between home and world was so thin, it might have been a prayer. Every family had its way of tuning the flaps. Some would set them tight against snow. Others left a whisper of space to let sparks escape. It was intuition passed through generations, each adjustment part of an unspoken understanding between human and wind. When a gust caught the flap just right, the tippy side, and the smoke trailed out like exhaled memory. This was thermal management by poetry, a home that responded to breath and storm with equal grace. It was alive, and its lungs, that humble hole at the top, kept it so. Without it, the air would have thickened, the fire would have died, and the long winter nights would have been just another kind of tomb. But with it, the tippy didn't just endure the cold, it turned it into a collaborator. And beneath that soft breathing roof of hide and wind, there was more than ventilation at play. There was insulation, thick, clever, and made of the very creature that once roamed outside in herds. The Great Plains didn't offer mercy, but they did offer buffalo, and that, in thermodynamic terms, was about the same thing. The animal that had kept humans alive in every possible way also turned into their winter walls. Buffalo hide wasn't just material, it was nature's idea of a luxury blanket, thick enough to stop wind, flexible enough to breathe, and conveniently waterproof, thanks to the animal's own oily resilience. In short, it was the kind of insulation you couldn't buy, even if you sold your horse. The women of the plains turned this raw power into architecture. Their tools were scrapers, bone needles, and patience sharpened by generations. Each hide was soaked, stretched, and smoked until it softened to a pliable armor, warm as devotion, tough as marriage. They stitched the pieces together into vast coverings, sometimes 15 feet wide, heavy enough to withstand the tantrums of a winter storm. Every seam was overlapped like fish scales, making the whole thing a windproof skin, not impenetrable, but feeling. If the cold found a way in, it didn't stay long. Inside, the hides did more than block the weather. They created layers. Many tipis were double-lined, an outer wall of buffalo hide, and an inner curtain made of lighter skins or woven mats. Between them, a thin pocket of air formed a natural insulation barrier, the same principle modern engineers use for double-glazed windows, except this version was infinitely more portable and smelled faintly of smoke and roasted meat. It wasn't just science, it was choreography. In winter, women adjusted the hides daily, pulling them tighter when the wind screamed, loosening them when the sun returned. Snow was sometimes piled around the base, not to block it, but to seal warmth in like nature's caulking. The result was a living wall that responded to the season hour by hour. You could call it sustainable architecture, but that would sound far too smug. For them, it was simply life. The hides also carried memory. Each one bore the marks of its animal scars, burns, scratches, old arrow wounds. Some families left these visible, believing the spirit of the buffalo remained present in the hide. In a sense, the walls themselves were watching, protecting, participating. The tipi wasn't just insulated by matter, it was insulated by meaning, and it worked. Explorers and settlers who stumbled into winter camps were baffled. How could a structure made of animal skin be warm enough to survive a blizzard? But step inside, and the confusion melted along with their frostbitten noses. The air was soft, the floor padded with robes, the sound muffled. The snow outside was distant, irrelevant. You could almost forget the cold existed, until you stepped out again and remembered it all at once. The secret wasn't thickness, it was intelligence. The hides didn't trap heat so much as they managed it, holding enough warmth to comfort, but enough breathability to prevent suffocation. The tipi didn't create artificial weather, it let the natural rhythm of heat and air do its work, moderated by hide and human habit. And at the center of it all, quietly holding its authority, burned the fire, the oldest invention of all, and the one that made every other detail worth the trouble. The hides wrapped it like a heart within a chest, and their glow danced in answer to its light. At the center of every tipi, there was fire, not metaphorical warmth, not symbolic comfort, but an actual living blaze that cracked, hissed, and negotiated directly with the gods of cold. Everything else revolved around it. The smoke hole above existed because of it. The hides were arranged for it, and the people themselves orbited it like cautious planets. If the tipi was a body, the fire was its heartbeat, steady, luminous, and absolutely unforgiving when disrespected. This wasn't the kind of fire you find in a modern fireplace, politely framed behind glass. This one demanded attention. It had to be fed constantly, not too much, not too little, and always with wood that burned evenly. Cottonwood, cedar, willow. In the absence of wood, buffalo chips were used, dried dung, hand-collected from the prairie, and stacked like sacred bricks of efficiency. They burned hot, clean, and smokeless, which is more than can be said for most human inventions, since there was no shame in burning dung, only gratitude that it kept your bones from freezing. The fire pit sat low and central, lined with stones that absorbed heat during the evening and released it slowly through the night. These stones were the secret undercurrent of comfort, a primitive thermal battery before anyone thought of electricity. When the flames dimmed, the stones still whispered heat into the room, a slow pulse of stored sunlight from summers long gone. Around it, shadows moved like water, soft and alive, as if the entire tipi was breathing in rhythm with the fire. It wasn't just warmth that the fire provided, it was light, smell, and sound, the sensory glue of existence. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence that came after the wind died down. The scent of smoke clung to every hide, every robe, every child's hair, so deeply that it became the smell of safety itself. Outside, the cold was indifferent and infinite. Inside, the fire drew a border, a glowing circle of life cut neatly out of the dark, and it was sacred. Fire wasn't treated as a tool, it was treated as a guest. Never stepped over, never mocked, always fed with intention. To mishandle it was to risk not only frostbite but also spiritual imbalance. Some plains tribes viewed it as a messenger, carrying prayers upward in the smoke. When flames flickered high, it was a sign of approval. When they sputtered, someone had forgotten respect. You could warm your hands by it, cook your meal over it, and confess your soul to it, all before sunrise. At night, families gathered around it, wrapped in buffalo robes, eyes reflecting gold. They told stories that stretched beyond time of tricksters, hunters, spirits, and stars. Children drifted to sleep to the sound of wood popping, their faces glowing orange, their dreams smelling faintly of cedar. The fire blurred the line between day and night, between the living and the ancestral. It wasn't merely heat, it was continuity. And when morning came, long before the sun touched the horizon, someone would stir the ashes, coax the embers back to life, and rebuild the flame. Because even a single hour without it was unthinkable. The tipi lived through fire, breathed through smoke, and dreamed through warmth. But fire alone wasn't enough. It burned hot and bright, yes, but its reach was limited, fading at the edges, where warmth turned to chill and sleep waited. That's where something older, simpler, and far more human took over. The arrangement of bodies, the circle of closeness that made the night survivable. If modern design had half the logic of a winter tipi, architects would finally stop pretending that open-concept living works. Inside that circle of hides and firelight, nothing was wasted, not space, not heat, not even breath. The way people slept was not random. It was physics performed by family. Everyone had a place, and that place was determined by warmth, age, and, occasionally, who snored the least. The sleeping pattern followed the fire's rhythm. At the center, the hearth, the flames whispered and glowed, casting slow light across faces arranged in a ring. Adults lay nearest the embers, forming the first line of heat conservation. Their buffalo robes spread thick over hides and furs. Children and elders were nestled between them, wrapped tight, safe in the middle, the living insulation of the human circle. A baby's cradle board might be set close enough to catch the fire's warmth, but never its sparks. Swaddled in soft fur that smelled faintly of smoke and milk. It wasn't romance, it was strategy. Sleeping close meant fewer bodies losing heat to the cold air. The tipi became a collective furnace, each body radiating into the next. And because the floor was layered with buffalo hides, the ground itself stayed warm, a luxury no castle could offer. The fire's heat rose, the hides held it, and the circle kept it alive. There was also a quiet etiquette to the arrangement. People didn't toss and turn or stretch out into space. Space was a shared resource, like air or patience. The order of the circle reflected kinship and respect. The head of the family slept opposite the entrance, commanding the best view of both the door and the fire. Guests were placed near the entrance, a polite gesture that also made for a quick exit if things got awkward. When the wind howled outside, it wasn't met with panic or drama. Someone would simply shift closer to the center, another would pull the robe tighter, and the fire's glow would deepen, steadying the mood of the whole room. The sound of breathing, dozens of slow, layered breaths, filled the tipi like a soft tide. Warmth became communal. Nobody truly slept alone. The entire structure slumbered as one. Sometimes, in the small hours, when the fire had sunk into embers, someone, usually an older woman with a memory of every winter before, would stir and feed it again. The act was silent, sacred, automatic. She'd adjust the logs, breathe life back into the flame, and the walls would blush orange once more. There was no need to wake the others. The warmth would do it gently. And as the night deepened, with the wind scratching faintly at the hides, the entire tipi became a cocoon of heat and breath. The bodies around the fire weren't just sleeping, they were sustaining the system. It was domestic physics disguised as tenderness. This was how people survived in a world that didn't particularly want them to. They didn't isolate, they gathered. Heat wasn't a luxury to be owned, it was a rhythm to be shared. The fire burned at the center, but the real warmth came from the bodies curled around it. Heartbeat against heartbeat, the living circle that turned the coldest plains into something almost merciful. And in that steady closeness, that quiet hum of shared breath and soft fur, another kind of warmth began to emerge. The kind that no fire could make and no storm could steal. The simple, unstoppable heat of human proximity. Modern civilization tends to treat body heat as an embarrassment. We install heaters to replace it, thermostats to regulate it, and entire industries to deny that sleeping close to someone else might actually make sense. But on the Great Plains, when the wind could flay the land bare, warmth wasn't a matter of dignity, it was a matter of physics. The human body, inconvenient, mortal, steaming with invisible power, became the most reliable source of energy available. Inside the tipi, heat didn't come just from the fire, it came from people themselves, from the soft, radiant persistence of flesh and breath. The body, after all, produces around 100 watts of heat at rest, which means a tipi full of family members was basically a prehistoric power plant. The trick wasn't to invent warmth, but to stop wasting it. By sleeping pressed against each other, wrapped in robes of fur and skin, they created a living heat exchange, more efficient than anything designed since it was communal engineering at its most intimate. Parents, children, grandparents, all layered together like strata in an ancient earth. Nobody pretended it was glamorous. There were elbows, snores, the occasional complaint about someone's cold feet. But when the temperature outside dropped low enough to turn your breath into frost, no one cared about elegance. Comfort came from contact. Warmth is a shared performance, not a personal achievement. Even the furs joined in. Buffalo robes and wolf pelts weren't just blankets. They were thermal amplifiers. The hides trapped the heat between bodies and then released it slowly, creating an environment where the cold never truly reached the skin. At dawn, when the fire had burned down to embers, a thin layer of frost might glisten on the outer wall, evidence that the warmth inside had held its ground all night. There was an unspoken humility in it all. To rely on another person's body to stay warm was to admit something profoundly human, that independence was a myth best saved for summer. In winter, survival was collaboration. The warmth between two people wasn't symbolic, it was measurable. visible in the condensation that formed above their shared breath. Each inhale and exhale contributed to the invisible atmosphere that kept the tipi alive. The air grew thick, not in a suffocating way, but in a way that made the interior feel inhabited by the collective pulse of everyone within. The sound of sleep, soft breathing, quiet turns, the occasional mutter from a dreamer became a form of weather in itself, and somehow it was enough. No one froze, no one woke up bitter with cold. The balance between body, fur, and flame held through the longest nights. It's easy to romanticize it now, to imagine those winter evenings as cozy or idyllic. They weren't. They were practical. They were biological necessity wrapped in hide and humility. But in that necessity lay something close to grace. In sharing heat, people also shared dreams, fears, silence, all the quiet things that don't survive in individual rooms with locked doors and humming radiators. Out there, in a land that punished solitude, warmth was proof of cooperation. Every degree of heat was earned together, and when the fire waned or the wind howled, it wasn't panic that stirred the sleepers. It was someone shifting closer, an instinct older than language. The tipi didn't need insulation made of fiberglass or science. It had skin, human and animal, and the knowledge that the simplest kind of contact could hold back an empire of cold. And yet, that contact was just one layer of the system. The body provided the warmth, but the clothing, the layered, fur-lined, handmade armor of the plains, made sure it stayed there. If the tipi was a living furnace, then the clothing inside it was the insulation lining its walls, a second skin between human vulnerability and winter's enthusiasm for murder. On the Great Plains, what you wore wasn't fashion, it was architecture in motion. Every piece of clothing had a thermal logic, a design refined over centuries of freezing, thawing, and learning that survival depended less on bravery and more on fur density. People didn't walk around in the delicate fabrics that later Europeans adored. There were no satin cuffs or symbolic discomforts. Clothing here was built to endure, layer upon layer of softened buckskin, elk hide, and buffalo fur created garments that could shrug off frostbite and still move with the body. Even indoors, people kept some layers on, not out of paranoia, but practicality. The tipi stayed warm, yes, but the cold was always waiting, just beyond a few millimeters of hide. Each item carried its own small genius. Moccasins, for instance, were lined with fur or grass to trap heat from the feet, one of the body's most treacherous exits for warmth. Leggings and tunics overlapped so that no wind could sneak through. And buffalo robes, those enormous weighty cloaks worn with the fur turned inward, could turn a person into their own microclimate. The hair trapped warm air against the skin, while the hide blocked wind. Wrapped people in one, and you'd create a portable summer. The materials were as deliberate as the shapes. Buckskin breathed, fur repelled moisture, and each garment was sewn with sinew, flexible, durable, slightly elastic, allowing the seams to expand and contract with the wearer and the weather alike. Some coats were smoked to waterproof them, the scent lingering faintly like a warning to the rain. Don't even try. Children were wrapped, as if preparing for siege. Layers of fur and hide cocooned them, and sometimes, small stones heated by the fire were tucked near their feet inside the robes. The warmth radiated just long enough for sleep to take hold. Meanwhile, adults adjusted layers throughout the night, adding or peeling back hides depending on the fire's mood. It was a full-body conversation with the elements. No thermostats, just intuition, and it wasn't ugly. These clothes were functional, yes, but also beautiful. Patterns painted or beaded onto hides carried stories, family marks, or protective symbols. Even in the deep cold, there was room for grace. The designs weren't decoration so much as prayer stitched in color, proof that even in the harshest climate, aesthetics were a form of resistance. The efficiency was astonishing. An explorer once recorded stepping into a tipi during a blizzard only to find people sitting bare-shouldered near the fire, wrapped in nothing but robes, chatting as if it was spring. He later wrote that the air outside could crack a man's skin, while inside, the heat lulled one into forgetting the snow altogether. It wasn't magic, it was physics, dressed in buffalo. The plains people understood something the rest of the world keeps forgetting. Warmth isn't a privilege, it's a craft. The cold isn't an enemy to be fought. It's a guest to be managed, sometimes sternly, always respectfully. And clothing wasn't armor against nature, but an agreement with it. Still, For all its craftsmanship and genius, warmth required vigilance. Fire didn't tend itself, and buffalo hides didn't feed embers. Even the best insulation needed a keeper, someone who would rise in the quiet dark and make sure the heart of the tipi kept beating. Warmth, for all its comfort, is a jealous thing. Turn your back on it for long enough, and it leaves. Inside the tipi, this meant that the night fire, the small glowing nucleus that kept the world from freezing solid, required constant supervision. The cold didn't sleep, so neither could everyone. Someone always had to be half awake, half dreaming, ready to coax the flame back to life before it sulked into smoke. There were no alarms, no assigned schedules, no heroic declarations of duty. The system ran on instinct and habit. When the fire sank low, someone, often the eldest woman in the household, though not always, would stir quietly from the warmth of her robe, push herself upright, and reach for the woodpile. The tipi creaked faintly in the wind, hides flexing like muscle. She would add a log or two, maybe a handful of buffalo chips, lean close, and blow until the embers brightened. The faint hiss of rekindled flame was the sound of continued survival. Then she'd slip back under the furs without ceremony, leaving the others none the wiser. The trick was balance. Too much fuel, and the tipi smoked like an overconfident chimney. Too little, and everyone woke up swearing at frost. There was a choreography to it. Open the flap a little to draw the air, adjust the stones around the pit, tuck the hides closer at the base. Every movement had its reason. Even half asleep, the caretaker knew the fire's language, which crackle meant contentment, which pop meant trouble. In deeper winter, the task became almost devotional. The wind outside could sound like tearing cloth, shrieking across the plains. Inside, the warmth was fragile, a bubble of mercy surrounded by infinity. The person keeping watch sat in that silence, eyes fixed on the red pulse of coals, aware that everything beyond the circle of light was absolute. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like reverence. To feed the fire at 3 meter was to feed life itself. Sometimes the watch passed quietly from one sleeper to another. A father's hand brushed a son's shoulder, wordless exchange, and the boy, still half in dream, would add a chip or shift a log, learning the rhythm the same way one learns breathing. No one had to explain why. You kept the fire alive because the fire kept you alive. The wood itself told stories. Cottonwood burned fast, willow hissed, cedar sang faintly. Some people mixed woods for mood, a little cedar for scent, a bit of pine for quick heat, dung for endurance. The smoke curled upward, slow and blue, tracing a path through the hole above. Watching it was a kind of meditation, proof that warmth was leaving, but gently, on its own terms. By dawn, when the first grey light seeped through the smoke hole, the fire was often down to embers again. That was fine. Someone would stir them, feed them, and start the day anew. There were no ashes of defeat here, only the quiet continuation of heat through the long conversation between people and flame. But maintaining the inner fire wasn't the only science at play. The air itself, the invisible exchange between inside and outside, breath and wind, had to be managed with equal precision. The tipi didn't just need warmth, it needed to breathe. It takes a certain humility to accept that air knows more about balance than you do. The plains people understood that. They didn't fight the wind, they befriended it. Every breath that entered or escaped the tipi was part of a quiet negotiation. Oxygen for fire, smoke for safety, freshness for life. What most of us would call ventilation, they treated like diplomacy. The difference between warmth and suffocation was measured not in degrees, but in how well you listened to the air. The secret, again, was the structure itself. The tipi wasn't a sealed pod, it was a breathing organism. The base was deliberately left slightly open, just enough for air to slip in under the hides. Cold air crept in low, fed the fire, and pushed the smoke upward toward the central hole. That rising draft, invisible but constant, carried everything unbreathable out through the top. It was convection before science textbooks had the nerve to name it. Settlers who built their little square houses nearby never quite understood why their chimneys backfired or their windows iced over from their own breath. The answer was shape. A box traps air, a cone moves it. The plains tribes had built what physicists would later call a self-regulating heat exchange system, though they would have simply called it sensible living. The shape pulled the air through in an elegant spiral, a kind of soft tornado of warmth and circulation. Orientation mattered too. The tipi door always faced east, not just for symbolism, though sunrise certainly had its charm, but for practicality. The prevailing winds across the plains came from the west. By facing the opposite direction, the smoke hole caught the wind at just the right angle to pull smoke out rather than blow it back in. You didn't need a compass, just observation and memory, how the wind moved through the grass, how it pushed the hides during storms, how it carried sound across the plains. Architecture wasn't a discipline, it was a conversation with weather. This system worked even in the worst conditions. When the temperature dropped below freezing, the warm air from inside created a faint updraft that kept snow from accumulating on the upper flaps. Meanwhile, the cooler air drawn in from below stayed too low to chill the sleepers, because the fire's thermal column dominated the center. It was all invisible geometry, the kind of natural efficiency you only get when you're designing for survival, not aesthetics. And the result was extraordinary. The air inside a well-tended tipi never felt stagnant. It carried warmth, but not heaviness, smoke, but not suffocation. The faint scent of burning cedar mixed with the dry tang of hides and the softer warmth of breath. You could sit for hours by the fire and never cough from smoke. It didn't linger. It drifted a controlled exhale from the heart of the shelter into the cold night sky. Even the tiniest details mattered. When a storm blew hard from the west, the flaps were angled to narrow the exit. If the wind shifted east, they opened wider to draw it out. It was a performance repeated every day of winter. No words, just instinct. The tipi adjusted as naturally as the human lungs it sheltered. And so, the entire structure breathed. It inhaled the cold, exhaled the smoke, and kept its pulse steady with each flicker of fire. Inside, people could sleep, talk, or dream without realizing that physics itself was working tirelessly above their heads. That constant balance between warmth and breath defined life in the tipi. But winter didn't stay still, and neither did they. As the seasons turned and the air shifted, everything about the tipi, its walls, its angle, even its height could change too. The tipi was not a static home, it was a shapeshifter. Its design lived in conversation with the seasons, bending and breathing with the land's moods. On the plains, where the temperature could swing from blistering heat to bone-breaking cold, survival meant mastering transformation. The same structure that held warmth like a sealed drum in January could breathe like a reed in July. Most architecture fights the weather. The tipi flirted with it. In summer, when the air shimmered above the grass and the buffalo herds moved north, the tipi opened itself. The hides were rolled up from the base, letting the wind snake through the circle and sweep out the trapped heat. The smoke hole at the top was widened, turning the whole structure into a chimney for coolness. Families sat in the open shade, the breeze touching their faces like water. You could see children's laughter floating in and out of the doorway with the light. The tipi not a fortress, but a lung. Come autumn, it began to close again. Hides were lowered and tightened. The structure crouched closer to the ground, like an animal preparing for sleep. By winter, the transformation was complete. Extra hides were added. Snow was piled around the base for insulation, and sometimes a lining of willow mats or reeds created another inner wall. Snow, the enemy outside, became the ally below, sealing cracks, deadening wind, and turning the tipi into a fortress of silence. If the temperature dropped further, families would pack the base with earth or frozen grass, anything that kept air from creeping in. Some tipis were half dug into the ground during deep cold, creating natural insulation from the frozen earth. The result was astonishing. While outside the world groaned under frost, inside you could sit berammed by the fire and listen to the wind without feeling it. Mobility was another form of adaptation. When the weather shifted or herds migrated, the entire village moved with them. A tipi could be dismantled, packed, and carried within an hour, poles dragged behind horses or dogs in a triangular frame called a travois, hides folded and tied. The rhythm of life was seasonal, nomadic, perfectly timed with the migration of buffalo and the pulse of the land. Home was never a location. It was wherever the fire could be rebuilt. This mobility made stagnation impossible. The plains tribes never allowed their world to decay under the weight of permanence. When the environment changed, so did they. The tipi didn't resist nature, it adapted to her. A structure that could rise, breathe, and vanish with the wind was a kind of humility the modern world forgot how to build. And all these adaptations weren't mechanical tricks, they were knowledge, passed down not through blueprints but through gestures. How to tilt the poles for wind, how to angle the flaps for air, how to read the horizon for storms. Children grew up watching this seasonal dance, learning to sense when to seal the hides tighter, when to open the base, when to trust the snow to do its quiet work. By the time winter settled in earnest, the tipi was at its most perfect form, closed, lined, sealed, and glowing from within like a lantern in the void. Outside, the wind screamed through the plains. Inside, the air was still, the walls warm to the touch, the light of the fire moving across sleeping faces like a second sunrise. And that light did something else, something that no scientific explanation quite captures. It created a sense of safety so deep it turned silence into comfort. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the small glowing circle of human presence. It was there, in those long winter nights, that warmth stopped being merely physical. The sound of crackling fire, the play of shadows on hides, the soft, even breath of people asleep. These were not just survival mechanisms, they were a kind of music. The cold has a sound, a kind of hollow stillness that can make the bones ring. Out on the Great Plains, in the dead of winter, it was everywhere. The kind of silence that pressed on the ears, deep and exacting, broken only by the groan of wind or the crack of frozen grass. Inside the tipi, though, it was different. Sound returned, soft, human, deliberate. The world outside was vast and indifferent, but within the circle of hides, there was an audible heartbeat. The fire made most of the music. Its rhythm never quite repeated, a shifting percussion of pops, crackles, and sighs that changed as the wood burned down to glowing bone. Each sound carried reassurance. The wind could scream all it wanted. As long as the fire still murmured, life went on. The walls themselves joined the chorus, rustling faintly as the hides expanded and contracted with the heat, whispering in their stitched voices. Even the air had texture, warm currents brushing across skin, stirring hair, carrying the faint smell of cedar and smoke. The light was a different kind of warmth, one that reached the mind before it reached the body. The fire's glow painted the hides in shifting gold and amber, the walls flickering with silhouettes that moved like memories. Every gesture, every glance, became mythic under that light. It was the original cinema, shadows cast in motion on curved walls, stories told not just with words but with illumination. There's a kind of calm that comes from watching light move on skin and fur, a primitive reassurance that nothing truly terrible can happen as long as something burns. The plains people didn't just live by that rule, they ritualized it. The firelight was a kind of border between chaos and safety, between the frozen, merciless plain and the tiny sphere of existence that still remembered laughter. It wasn't quiet, exactly. It was peaceful in the way a heartbeat is peaceful, rhythmic, unhurried, always there. The soft breath of sleepers, the faint shift of robes, the muted hiss when someone stirred the coals. These were sounds of civilization, but without any of the noise civilization usually insists upon. Every sound was essential, every silence earned. Outside, the moon might burn white across the plains, and frost would glitter on the hides like tiny stars. But inside, the light belonged to humans, flickering, imperfect, beautifully alive. It softened everything. Faces looked younger, fear looked smaller. The fire erased the harsh edges of survival and replaced them with something slower, almost contemplative. Psychologists, the modern kind, armed with notebooks and anxieties, would later call this associative warmth, the way heat, sound, and light together can trick the brain into peace. But there was nothing artificial about it here. The warmth didn't come from a machine or a switch. It came from participation. To stay warm, you had to feed the fire, adjust the flaps, shift your body closer to another. Comfort was earned, and that earned warmth became its own kind of faith. The plains tribes understood what most heated apartments have forgotten. Safety isn't about separation from the elements, it's about harmony with them. The firelight wasn't an escape from winter, it was winter's other face, the softer one, the one that listened. Every tipi glowed like that through the night, small constellations of humanity scattered across the endless plain. And in the morning, when the first light crept through the smoke hole, the world felt new again, as if survival itself had been rewritten overnight by warmth and quiet persistence. But that warmth wasn't merely physical or emotional, it was sacred. Fire was not just heat, it was a being, a witness, a keeper of balance. And so, Before the next log was added or the embers stirred, there was always a moment of respect. In the tipi, fire was more than a convenience. It was the resident deity, the glowing mediator between human and element. People didn't just live with it, they lived for it. Every ember was treated as a living thing, and every spark, a messenger between this world and whatever watched from the sky. Modern life has trained us to think of fire as a tool, something to control, regulate, and occasionally sue if it misbehaves. But on the Great Plains, fire had authority. You didn't command it, you courted it. It began the same way every morning. Someone would kneel beside the pit, stir the ash, and coax the coals awake. The act was half domestic, half prayer. Breath met ember, smoke rose like an offering. The new flame wasn't just warmth, it was continuity. It meant that the world hadn't ended overnight, that the cold had failed again to erase the fragile light of human persistence. There were rules about fire, and none of them was superstition. You never stepped over it, that would insult the spirit within it. You never threw trash into it, that would cloud its breath. You didn't point at it, spit near it, or use it for mindless amusement. Fire demanded manners. To mistreat it wasn't bad luck, it was bad form, the kind that nature always remembers to punish later. Ceremonially, the hearth mirrored the sacred fires kept in larger rituals, a domestic echo of cosmic order. Fire symbolized the sun's presence even in its absence, and keeping it alive through the dark months was a way of ensuring the universe didn't collapse from neglect. Each tipi's flame was a miniature sunrise, each family a private cosmos. When prayers were offered, they were often fed to the fire. Tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, substances that carried meaning were dropped into the flames to release their essence. The smoke carried the words upward, curling through the smoke hole into the night sky, a visible bridge between matter and intention. There was something breathtakingly simple about it. You spoke to the divine through combustion. Children learned early that fire was both protector and judge. Touch it carelessly, and it would remind you why reverence exists. But approach it with respect, and it became a friend, an ancient collaborator in warmth and storytelling. Around the fire, lessons were told: how to hunt, how to sow, how to behave. The light illuminated the faces of the elders as they spoke, their gestures amplified by the flicker, every story a shadow dance of memory. The Plains people weren't the only ones to sanctify flame, but they perfected the intimacy of it. Their fire wasn't locked in temples or hidden behind walls. It burned right there in the middle of daily life, sacred and ordinary all at once. You could cook on it, pray to it, and stare into it until your thoughts dissolved into smoke. And when the night deepened and everyone else drifted to sleep, the last person awake always glanced at the fire before lying down. A quiet nod of recognition, a promise to keep the balance another day. Fire had been their companion since before words, and still they treated it like something borrowed, because it was the next generation would inherit that reverence, not through sermons or doctrine, but through watching. The gestures, stirring embers, shielding flame, adding the right wood, were passed down like lullabies. Knowledge didn't shout, it glowed. And it was this inheritance, this choreography of warmth and respect, that made sure the flame never died out. Because fire could be fed, but wisdom had to be remembered. The art of staying warm on the plains wasn't something you learned, it was something you absorbed. Knowledge didn't arrive through lectures or diagrams. It drifted in with the smoke, carried in gestures so ordinary they became invisible. Children grew up watching the way their mothers adjusted the smoke flaps when the wind changed, or how their fathers arranged stones around the fire so the heat lasted until morning. Warmth was a family trade, inherited by observation and repetition, like breathing or humor. No one ever said, "Now, watch closely." They didn't have to. A child playing near the edge of the tipi could feel when the air shifted, the subtle current that signaled someone had opened a flap or stoked the fire. They'd hear the difference in the sound of the hides when the temperature dropped, the crack of tightening seams in the cold. It was environmental literacy at its purest, reading comfort through texture, sound, and air. A girl might help her mother soften a buffalo hide for a new cover, learning by muscle memory when the hide was supple enough to block wind. A boy might notice how his grandfather fed the fire in small increments, never dumping in wood all at once, the difference between control and chaos. And when snow piled at the base of the tipi, someone would explain, not with words, but with a gesture, that it wasn't a problem. It was insulation. You didn't fight the cold, you used it. By adolescence, these lessons formed a kind of quiet science. You knew how to predict a storm by the way the air tasted. You knew which side of the tipi to reinforce before dawn. You knew the rhythm of wood, which crackle meant heat, which meant smoke, which meant you'd chosen the wrong log again. This was education, but stripped of arrogance. You didn't master the environment, you learned to cooperate with it. Elders carried the deepest knowledge, not just of technique, but of philosophy, how warmth was tied to humility. They remembered winters where the fire almost died, where the smoke refused to rise, where frost crept in through the seams. And they'd tell those stories not to scare, but to remind. Survival wasn't about outsmarting nature, it was about remembering how easily she could forget you. Every fire tended was an apology, every adjustment of hide a small act of gratitude. And because everything inside the tipi was shared, the teaching was communal. There were no experts, no specialists, only people contributing to the same warmth. A woman preparing a robe taught patience through her rhythm. A man patching a wind tear taught geometry through instinct. Even the children contributed, fetching, kindling, packing snow, learning what it meant to be necessary. The real inheritance wasn't knowledge of materials, but awareness, a sensory map of the relationship between body and world. To live in a tipi was to become fluent in temperature, to know the difference between warm enough and safe enough. It was the kind of intelligence modern life has smothered under thermostats and convenience. Generations passed this literacy like a secret, unspoken, practical, alive. You could lose your possessions, your camp, even your herds, but if you knew how to make warmth, you were never truly poor. And somewhere in that passing down, in the way hands repeated what other hands had done before, warmth became something greater than comfort. It became continuity, because in the end, what they were really preserving wasn't heat, it was connection to the land, to each other, to the rhythm of breath and fire. And that rhythm led, inevitably, to the last and quietest truth, that warmth was never just a temperature. It was a state of being, something that held families together long after the embers cooled. In the end, warmth wasn't about surviving the cold, it was about remembering what made the cold bearable. The tipi, with its hides and fire and careful engineering, was just the stage. The real performance happened in silence, in the slow exhale of a child sleeping against their mother's shoulder, in the way the light from the hearth flickered over faces half lit and half dreaming, in the small rustle of someone reaching out beneath the furs to find another hand. Warmth was intimacy disguised as temperature. It was the invisible thread that ran through every act, cutting wood, stitching hides, tending the fire at midnight. People didn't stay warm because they had buffalo hides. They stayed warm because they had each other. Every ember, every robe, every shared breath built a network of care that no storm could undo. The plains in winter were merciless, a geography built for humility. But inside those circles of hide and smoke, humans had managed to create something astonishing. Comfort without abundance, security without walls, luxury without excess. The warmth wasn't sealed in, it was constantly moving from fire to stone, from hide to skin, from skin to heart. You could feel it ripple through the air, gentle and continuous, the way conversation lingers even after the words end. When the wind outside howled like a god demanding attention, nobody panicked. They simply pulled the hides tighter, pressed closer, and trusted the circle. There was no fear of nature, because nature was already part of the house. The wind at the flaps, the stars above the smoke hole, the fire eating the air and giving it back as light. It wasn't humans against the cold, it was humans with it, negotiating peace every night. And that peace shaped their psychology as much as their shelters. A people who spent their winters huddled together in shared breath and flame didn't need to invent metaphors for connection, they lived it. They understood that warmth wasn't something you produced, it was something you maintained, like trust. Lose attention, and it fades. Tend it, and it thrives. If a tipi could speak, it might have said, "You don't own the fire, you host it. You keep it alive, you respect its moods, and in return, it spares you." The same could be said of community, love, or any fragile miracle that depends on attention to stay alive. By dawn, when the fire softened into embers and the hides glowed faintly with morning light, the air inside the tipi was still warm, not just from heat, but from the residue of togetherness. Someone would stir, stretch, and quietly rebuild the flame, just as their parents had done, and their parents before them. Outside, the frost glittered like powdered glass. Inside, the world was soft, golden, breathing. That was the true meaning of warmth on the winter plains, not an escape from the cold, but a reconciliation with it. Warmth was the proof that humanity could make peace with the impossible, that life, when lived in cooperation, could turn even the bleakest landscape into something tender. And long after the buffalo vanished and the Tipis fell silent, that warmth, that ancient, invisible architecture of care, still lingers in the memory of firelight. Because warmth was never just heat. It was the reminder that, even in a world made of wind and frost, there was always a circle of light, and inside it, someone waiting to keep the flame alive. It began with trembling, not awe or faith or art, but the kind of trembling that comes when the wind slices through a ribcage and bones hum from the cold. Before there were songs or names, there was the desperate choreography of survival, hands cupped against embers, shoulders pressed together under animal skin still smelling of rain. Fire wasn't discovered so much as begged for. It was a brief miracle, a temporary god that turned blue lips into something human again. Those first flames changed more than temperature. They redrew the boundaries between death and companionship. Bodies that once kept distance now leaned in, not out of affection but necessity. One person's warmth leaked into another's, and the air between them, thick with smoke and sweat, became something new. Safety. Heat made strangers into kin, if only for a night. Anthropologists like to call this the birth of social cohesion. But that's just a polite way of saying people learned to tolerate each other because freezing alone was worse. Archaeological sites in South Africa show ash layers dating back nearly 1 million years early. Hearths where Homo erectus gathered not just to cook, but to stay alive together. The pattern of scorched bones and stone tools suggests circles, and circles suggest trust, or at least a truce. Firelight demanded you stay close enough to see the whites of another's eyes. It's strange how something so physical became emotional. The heat that first licked their skin also softened their nerves. Around those flames, fear began to share a bed with relief. They watched sparks climb into the dark and disappear, the same way breath vanished into cold air. Maybe that's when warmth started to feel like love, a shared resistance against disappearing. Still, the fire was unpredictable, almost moody. Too much wind and it sulked. Too little air and it suffocated. It had to be fed constantly, like a god with stage fright. That endless feeding, the gathering of wood, the tending, the guarding, gave rhythm to life. And the rhythm, as always, gave rise to ritual. Sitting shoulder to shoulder in the amber glow, early humans learned something profound and rather inconvenient. Warmth wasn't just about fire. It was about proximity, attention, repetition, all the things that later would be called affection. And when dawn came, the embers faded into ash, and everyone looked at each other with a quiet, uncomfortable awareness. They had survived, but together, that was the real discovery. Not fire, but dependency, the kind that smolders long after the smoke is gone. Because once warmth becomes a habit, distance feels like extinction. And that's how the first spark led not just to survival, but to the invention of the circle, the shape that would define humanity's long night ahead. The circle wasn't designed, it simply happened, like erosion or gossip. A practical shape born from desperation. Fire burned at the center, and everything else arranged itself obediently around it. The geometry of survival. The circle meant everyone could reach the warmth without fighting over it. It also meant everyone could see everyone else. A blessing and an inconvenience. In those flickering rings of light, something subtle began to evolve. Self-awareness, faces glowed, shadows lengthened, and suddenly you weren't just a body, you were a visible creature with gestures, habits, and the unbearable gift of expression. The circle created theater. Someone always stared too long into the flames. Someone else whispered, another laughed too loud. Every small act became public. It's possible the first social anxiety began right there, beside the first social fire. But the circle also built trust, or something pretending to be it. Archaeologists call it commensality, the act of sharing food, warmth, and breath. Around the fire, differences dissolved into smoke. The strong, the weak, the too old, and the too young, all became equal participants in the fragile conspiracy of heat. The moment you stepped away, you weren't just cold, you were invisible. exiled to the dark where the eyes of predators glinted like distant stars. The fire's glow drew a line between us and everything trying to eat us. Over time, that simple arrangement hardened into culture. The circle became symbolic, the first architecture of belonging. From stone hearths to yurts, from round huts to the later amphitheaters of power, humanity kept replicating that same shape, as if afraid that straight lines might invite chaos. The roundness comforted us. It promised containment. No corners for spirits to hide in, no angles for secrets to collect. And within those early circles, roles began to crystallize. Someone had to feed the fire, someone had to tell the story, someone had to keep watch. The division of labor was born not out of ambition, but necessity. You can see traces of it in the soot patterns on cave walls. One side darker where the gatherers sat, another lighter where the hunters laid their tools. The circle wasn't equal, not really. It only looked that way in the glow. What's curious is how that geometry outlasted the purpose. Long after central heating made the hearth redundant, families kept forming circles, at tables, at rituals, at deaths. It's as if our bodies still remember that warmth requires symmetry. We keep gathering around flickering things, candles, screens, whatever hums in the dark, hoping the light will once again organize our chaos. Because once the circle existed, there was no going back to the straight line. It carried its own gravity, pulling us toward it, insisting that togetherness was the price of survival. And from that quiet orbit of bodies and breath, something new began to take shape, a strange economy where warmth itself became a kind of trade. At some point, warmth stopped being free. Once people learned how to trap it in hides, in fur, in other people, it became something you could own, or worse, withhold. Archaeologists have found Ice Age burials where one body is wrapped in layers of animal skin, while another lies naked beside it. The difference between privilege and punishment, measured in insulation, sharing heat became an unspoken transaction. You can almost picture it, the coldest nights in Paleolithic shelters, the air thick with breath, a handful of people pressed together under the same mammoth hide, who got to be in the middle and who was pushed to the edge. Warmth decided hierarchies long before money did. The earliest families weren't built from love or lineage, they were coalitions of compatible temperatures. Anthropologists who study Arctic and mountain nomads still describe these patterns today. Bodies arranged by necessity, not sentiment. Even in the frozen steppes of Siberia, groups slept skin to skin, facing inward to share body heat. The one who couldn't stand the closeness froze. Survival didn't reward the independent. It rewarded the and soon enough, the logic turned emotional. Warmth meant care, distance meant rejection. Parents who wrapped their infants tightly against their own skin were performing a form of prehistoric empathy, or perhaps just insurance against extinction. The earliest lullabies might have been the rhythmic sounds of two chests breathing in sync. By the time clothing evolved beyond practicality, it carried memory. The idea that to cover yourself was to preserve something sacred, to keep your heat from leaking into indifferent air. In some ancient societies, gifting a cloak or blanket was a declaration. I'm giving you my warmth, literally. And that small gesture rippled outward, shaping everything from trade to intimacy. Even today, the language of affection remains thermal. She's warm-hearted, he's cold as stone. We still measure kindness in degrees Celsius. It's an ancient hangover, a reminder that the emotional economy of modern love began as a negotiation of heat, a bartering system where proximity was survival and touch was credit. The skin economy made warmth a resource to manage, not just experience. And once something can be managed, it can also be stolen, hoarded, or taxed. The world's first inequities didn't appear in land or food. They appeared in who got to sit nearest the fire, under the thickest furs, inside the most forgiving arms. And from that primitive market of body and breath, the foundations of kinship emerged: trust, exchange, and dependency. Warmth had become the currency of belonging. But trust, as it turns out, has its own temperature, and soon it would start to fluctuate. When people began to sleep close enough to feel one another breathe, trust wasn't a virtue, it was a survival mechanism. Imagine lying in the dark of a Paleolithic shelter. The fire, a faint red pulse at the center, every inhalation and exhalation audible in the stillness. You had to believe that the person beside you wouldn't slit your throat for your furs before sunrise. That belief, that quiet, trembling faith in another's stillness, is what anthropologists now call the beginning of social trust. But really, it was just shared exhaustion, dressed as morality. Breath made intimacy physical long before language could make it emotional. In many traditional societies, the act of breathing together remained sacred. Among Arctic peoples, to share breath was to share life force. In parts of Polynesia, lovers were said to exchange souls by pressing their noses together, a practice born from the same primeval logic. Warmth and air are communal goods, not private ones. To let someone breathe near you was to acknowledge their right to exist within your fragile microclimate. The cold didn't forgive selfishness. You can't keep your own heat without keeping someone else's too. Over time, this constant proximity rewired the human nervous system. The smell of another's skin, the rhythm of shared sleep, the comfort of predictable presence, all became signals of safety. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer camps still note how people rarely sleep alone. The night is a communal event. Even dreams are social, their stories discussed over morning smoke. The physics of warmth became the foundation of morality. To share a blanket was good. To turn your back to the group was betrayal. The fire enforced these ethics better than any god could. It rewarded closeness, punished isolation, and made cooperation feel instinctive. The line between physical and emotional warmth blurred until it no longer existed. Breath itself became symbolic of kinship, inheritance, continuity. The Latin root spiritus meant both breath and spirit, a linguistic fossil of that ancient connection. Even now, we say someone took our breath away or breathed life into something, as if vitality could be transferred mouth to mouth. But trust is volatile. It warms until it burns. When groups grew larger and fires multiplied, that intimate rhythm fractured. People no longer knew every breath that stirred the smoke around them. Warmth, once shared between a few bodies, had to stretch across clans, then villages, then strangers, and with every expansion, a little of the heat leaked out. Still, the memory lingered, that low animal certainty, that safety meant togetherness, and togetherness meant warmth. So when the old fire gods faded, something else rose to take their place, a more domestic deity that burned not in the open air but inside the home itself. At some point, the fire stopped belonging to the forest and started belonging to the house. It was captured, domesticated, like a wild spirit tamed by routine. The hearth became the quiet altar of every dwelling, its smoke the daily prayer rising through the roof. To let it die out wasn't just inconvenient, it was blasphemy. In ancient Greece, families swore oaths before Hestia, goddess of the hearth, whose flame symbolized both ancestry and order. In Rome, Vesta's fire burned eternally, guarded by priestesses whose only job was to keep it breathing. Civilization, it seems, was one long anxiety attack about the fire going out. What's remarkable is how much that anxiety shaped domestic life. The hearth decided architecture, inheritance, even morality. The home center wasn't the door or the bed, it was the heat. Everything revolved around it. Meals, stories, births, deaths. Archaeologists studying Bronze Age dwellings in northern Europe have noted how the hearthstones were meticulously placed at the geometric center of each structure, as if symmetry could guarantee divine attention. But what the gods really demanded was vigilance. Someone always had to stay awake, feed the embers, stir the ash. Night watch became an act of devotion, passed down like religion itself. In Japan, families once honored Kyun, the kitchen deity who lived inside the stove, overseeing not only fire but family harmony. To anger him by neglecting the flame or wasting food risked illness, misfortune, or worse, a cold house. And there's no loneliness quite like a cold house. The hearth turned the practical into the sacred. It wasn't just about warmth anymore. It was about continuity. You could die, but the fire must not. It was the immortal part of the household, the ancestor that kept everyone alive. Its crackling became a kind of language, the family's pulse. In some cultures, newlyweds carried embers from their parents' hearths to light their own, literally transplanting lineage through flame. You didn't just inherit land, you inherited temperature, and the fire wasn't gentle. It demanded attention, fuel, obedience. It punished negligence with frostbite and smoke. Maybe that's why people projected gods into it, to give form to the constant, irrational labor of keeping it alive. They feared it, loved it, and depended on it all at once, which is probably the truest definition of faith ever invented. As centuries passed, the hearth became less divine and more domestic, but it never lost its authority. Even when stone houses replaced huts and fireplaces became decorative, people still arranged their lives around the illusion of central heat. The household remained a small cosmos, its gravity determined by warmth. Yet the fire's divine rule carried a cost. It began to dictate who could sit closest, who had the right to tend it, whose labor kept the flame alive. Warmth was no longer shared, it was managed. Hierarchy flickered into being, glowing faintly behind the flames. And soon, that soft orange light would harden into walls. Walls were a strange invention. They promised comfort, but whispered inequality. The moment heat could be contained, someone had to decide who got the best of it. In the earliest longhouses of Northern Europe, the hearth blazed at the center, but warmth still obeyed invisible borders. The elders and men slept closer to the glow. Women, children, and slaves drifted toward the cold edges. Archaeologists can read this hierarchy in the soil itself. Darker ash and compacted floor near the hearth, lighter, untouched earth near the doors. Warmth was a privilege that left geological evidence. Once roofs entered the picture, heat became both more efficient and more political. Architecture learned to play favorites. The wealthier families built thick-walled rooms to trap warmth. The poor huddled in communal smoke. Even ancient Roman villas reveal it. Radiant heating systems called hypocausts carried warmth under marble floors for the elite, while the servants who maintained them slept in the chill beneath. Fire, once communal, had become proprietary. Inside these new enclosures, the family itself rearranged. The hearth no longer united everyone equally, it divided them into roles. Someone cooked, someone stoked, someone waited. The act of keeping warm became invisible labor, mostly performed by women. Across centuries and cultures, warmth and servitude intertwined. To make a home cozy was often code for tending the flame without complaint. And yet, the architecture of warmth also shaped tenderness. Private rooms allowed new forms of closeness, softer, secretive ones. When cold stopped being a public enemy, warmth became a private gift. Lovers could now choose to share a bed, not because they'd freeze otherwise, but because habit had made the gesture sacred. The walls that separated families from the night also created rooms for intimacy. But the hierarchy remained, humming quietly beneath the bricks. Even today, houses tell the same story. The best-lit room reserved for guests. The radiators in children's rooms, weaker than in the master's suite. The kitchen still burning from dawn to dusk, its keeper still unseen. The social order of heat outlived its necessity, and as the architecture grew more complex, so did the politics of warmth. Families built bigger fires, higher chimneys, thicker curtains, anything to keep the world's cold out. But the more they sealed themselves in, the more distant they became from one another. Insulation, in every sense, was improving, because once warmth could be owned, marriage began to change too. It stopped being about the comfort of many and became a contract between two. The circle shrank again, this time into a pair, a new alliance forged less by passion and more by practicality. Before love songs and candlelight dinners, marriage was a matter of body temperature. In the Ice Age, coupling wasn't romantic, it was thermodynamic. To share a bed meant doubling your odds of surviving the night. Archaeologists studying ancient burials often find pairs positioned facing one another, their limbs intertwined as if mid-sleep. Warmth made fidelity easier to define. Whoever you could physically endure the longest beside was your partner. Over time, this alliance solidified into law. Among early agricultural societies, pairing off meant merging resources with thatch, livestock, fuel, everything required to keep a domestic fire alive. In that sense, a wedding was a merger of heating systems. The dowry wasn't just symbolic wealth. It was energy storage, blankets, furs, cooking pots, and bodies willing to labor through winter. Love might have been mentioned at the feast, but survival signed the contract. Even in language, warmth lingered as metaphor. To keep the home fires burning meant loyalty. To be a cold spouse meant betrayal. Cultures across the world linked marital harmony to heat management. In rural China, the Kong bed, a raised brick platform heated from below, was both sleeping space and negotiation table. Disputes often ended not in shouting, but in who got the warmer side. Anthropologists studying Siberian nomads observed similar arrangements, couples sleeping in specific orientations to share heat efficiently, their emotional rhythm tuned to physical temperature. The politics of warmth turned domestic. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just about tending the hearth, it became a measure of relational skill. A good spouse was someone who didn't let things go cold, literally or otherwise. And when things did go cold, it was rarely metaphor. In medieval Europe, divorce wasn't recognized, but separate bedrooms were the architectural version of emotional frostbite. Still, something unexpected emerged from this practical alliance. Affection, familiarity, forced by proximity, eventually softened into care. Two people surviving each other night after night developed rituals of warmth, a shared blanket folded just so, a hand checking another's breath in sleep, a silent agreement over who wakes first to rekindle the embers. Out of these gestures, tenderness took root, and as love stories began to replace survival manuals, the fire became symbolic, a prop in the theater of affection. Families painted it, poets worshipped it, and architects built ornate fireplaces as altars to domestic stability. But even as the hearth became decorative, the logic remained. The couple was now the household's thermal core, expected to radiate warmth outward to children, guests, and kin. Yet this thermal alliance carried a quiet tension. What happens when heat becomes emotional rather than physical? When proximity is replaced by expectation? Once the body was no longer needed to survive, the idea of warmth had to evolve. It began to drift inward, turning from firelight to feeling, from the physics of heat to the climate of the heart. And so, within those neatly heated walls, a new kind of chill appeared, invisible, psychological, and far harder to cure. Topic 8. The emotional climate indoors. Once the fire stopped being a necessity, it became a mood. Warmth shifted from something you could measure to something you could feel or fail to. The invention of stoves, chimneys, and eventually central heating freed families from the tyranny of tending the flame. But it also robbed them of an excuse to sit close. The hearth no longer gathered bodies together. The pipes did the work invisibly, humming like a polite servant who preferred not to be thanked. Inside these newly efficient homes, people discovered a different kind of cold. It wasn't in the air, but in the distance between chairs. Without the ritual of feeding wood and watching sparks, evenings grew quieter. The fire that once demanded conversation, or at least shared silence, was replaced by a steady, mechanical heat that required nothing from anyone. Comfort, achieved at last, proved terribly isolating. Historians trace this shift through architecture. In the 18th century, houses began to divide sharply into public and private zones. Parlors for show, bedrooms for retreat, dining rooms for performance. Each new wall trapped heat and emotion alike. The family, once a tight thermal cluster, began to fragment spatially. Parents, children, servants, each with their own space, their own temperature. The emotional climate cooled as the physical one stabilized. Even language began to record the drift. The cold shoulder, the warm welcome, the heated argument, idioms betraying how humans still measured relationships in terms of temperature. The irony, of course, was that no one needed to be near anyone anymore. Warmth was guaranteed by technology. Affection was optional. In diaries from the Victorian era, you find the same refrain. Rooms described as cozy, but lives described as empty. The more controllable heat became, the more elusive warmth felt. Anthropologists of the modern household often note how emotional regulation mirrors climate control. Too much intensity, and people open windows. Too little, and they light symbolic fires through gestures, gifts, apologies. Domestic love began to imitate central heating. Unseen, constant, slightly impersonal. And yet, even in this new comfort, the human body rebelled. We still gathered around flickering things, candles, fireplaces, oil lamps, not because we needed their heat, but because we missed their company. The fire had become a ghost, haunting us through nostalgia. Families posed for portraits beside it, not within its warmth, but its memory. By the time electricity arrived, the glow had shifted once more. The hearth became decorative, the fire metaphorical. But the instinct remained, to gather around a source of light, however artificial, to stare into something that hums softly in the dark, to pretend, for a moment, that we are still part of the same fragile circle. Because even in our perfectly heated rooms, the old equation lingers. Without shared heat, comfort feels hollow. And as the century advanced, humanity, being predictably sentimental, went in search of a new flame, one that didn't crackle, but glowed. When the last embers went out, we didn't extinguish the ritual, we just electrified it. The modern hearth hums now, not crackles. Its flames are pixelated and cold to the touch, but we still gather around it, as if warmth could travel through glass. The family circle became a semicircle of faces lit in bluish light, each person staring into their own private fire. Anthropologists studying domestic life in the digital age often note the eerie continuity. The television, when it first entered living rooms in the 1950s, was literally installed where the fireplace used to be. Same wall, same focus, same furniture arranged reverently around it. People ate dinner in front of it, fell asleep before it, measured silence by its hum. The glowing rectangle took over the role of mediator, telling stories, marking time, filling the air between bodies. And then came the smaller screens, handheld hearths that followed us into bed, into solitude, into the one place fire had never gone before, the pillow. The warmth these devices give off is negligible, but the illusion of connection they emit is enough to trick the nervous system. Scroll long enough through other people's lives, and your brain mistakes stimulation for belonging. We stare into them like ancestors once stared into flames, hypnotized by flicker and narrative. The new hearth doesn't require wood or faith, only attention. Its fuel is time, hours burned away by scrolling, streaming, swiping. It tells its own mythology, endless, consumable stories that mimic the oral traditions once told around firelight. The family circle has widened again, this time to include millions of unseen others glowing behind their own screens. We call it community, though it feels more like shared insomnia. Even the vocabulary stayed loyal to the old flame. We ignite conversations, kindle connections, watch things go viral. The language of combustion applied to algorithms. Yet, unlike the fires that bound early humans together, this one never dies, never demands tending. It doesn't even warm. It glows eternally, indifferent to whether anyone's watching. Still, late at night, when everything else is dark, there's something hauntingly familiar about that cold blue light reflecting in a human face. The posture hasn't changed in a million years. Shoulders curled inward, eyes flickering, mind adrift. We used to do this to survive the night. Now we do it to escape the day. And maybe that's the tragedy hidden inside progress. We've learned to make light without heat, to share presence without touch. The old gods of the hearth have been replaced by circuitry, but the worship looks the same, quiet, lonely, devotional. And as the glow follows us into every corner of our lives, one can't help but wonder what happens when warmth no longer needs a body at all. When the flame and the family that once surrounded it finally go cold. It didn't happen suddenly. The last real fire didn't go out with a hiss or a sigh. It just stopped being necessary. Homes stayed warm. Meals came faster. Stories moved to other rooms. The flame that had once kept us alive became a relic, a decorative flicker behind tempered glass. And somewhere in that long transition, the meaning of warmth changed entirely. It stopped being something we created together and became something we purchased, adjusted, or streamed. Anthropologists sometimes call this the post-thermal era, though that makes it sound more decisive than it is. The truth is, warmth didn't disappear, it dispersed. It became ambient, automated, democratic, and strangely lonely. You can set your home to 22 degrees and never think about another person's body again. The system hums, the sensors monitor, the air stays perfect. No need for touch, or gratitude, or vigilance. Warmth without story. But the human nervous system never got the memo. We're still built for proximity. Studies show that even now, people sleep better beside someone else, even if they never touch. Heart rates sink, cortisol drops, breath aligns, echoes of the ancient night when survival depended on shared temperature. Our biology remains communal, even when our architecture isn't. And so, the modern family keeps trying to simulate the lost flame. We light scented candles, install fake fireplaces, stream videos of campfires crackling endlessly on digital screens. We still gather around the glow, even if it's just a reflection on glass. The ritual persists, half memory, half denial. Deep down, something in us still believes that warmth is proof of life. The irony is exquisite. We've conquered the cold, but not the chill. We can heat the planet and still feel frozen inside it. The great project of civilization to master fire succeeded so thoroughly that we've forgotten what fire ever meant. It wasn't just energy. It was dependence, humility, rhythm, conversation, intimacy, everything inconvenient about being human. And so, in the quiet of our perfectly warmed rooms, the air feels slightly too still. The thermostats hum, obedient and exact, but they do not glow. They do not dance. They do not answer when the night feels too long. Perhaps that's why people still build campfires, even in backyards surrounded by neon and noise, a small rebellion against the sterile heat of modernity. For a few hours, they sit shoulder to shoulder again, watching something alive. Because no matter how far we evolve from the cave, every human story begins the same way, with a handful of trembling bodies gathered around a fragile light, trying not to vanish into the dark. Before there were stories to keep the dark entertained, there was the dark itself, vast, patient, and full of teeth. Night was the first thing humanity didn't understand but had to endure. Long before language, before the idea of home, there were just small, breathing clusters of flesh trying not to freeze. The air then wasn't just cold, it was personal, the kind that sliced through muscle and hummed against bone like a warning. Out in that endless black, you could hear everything but see nothing. Wind scraping through grass, the faint crack of something stepping on a branch that wasn't you, the slow blink of eyes that reflected firelight only when it was too late. Anthropologists have found traces of those nights in the simplest evidence: shallow pits for fires, circles of footprints pressed close together, overlapping so tightly that you can't tell where one person ended and another began. It wasn't camaraderie, it was physics. Skin against skin, trapped heat. Solitude didn't just mean loneliness, it meant death. And so, by sheer inconvenience, humanity invented company. There's something slightly comic about that, isn't there? The whole emotional apparatus, love, trust, attachment, all beginning because the climate refused to cooperate. You can almost picture it, a handful of trembling bodies under a strip of hide, arguing over who gets the middle spot, while something with sharper teeth sniffs at the wind. No one slept well, they just survived more quietly. Fear was a lullaby long before tenderness was. The nights stretched endlessly then. Fire, when it existed at all, was a fragile thing. It flickered, went out, came back reluctantly. Most of the time, warmth came from whoever didn't mind your knees against theirs. Every civilization, every myth about gods and creation, still carries that residue. The memory that safety once required being close enough to feel another person breathe. Before tribes or families or lovers, there were just bodies in the dark, pretending the others weren't strangers. And when the dawn finally came, they woke up alive, which was enough of a miracle to do it again. In that small victory that shared shiver under the same piece of fur, humanity learned the oldest rule of all. Surviving meant staying close, even when you didn't want to. The habit stuck. Long after the predators stopped circling and the ice retreated, the body still remembered that closeness meant life. Which brings us, inconveniently, to what came next, the strange economy of warmth, and how temperature became the first form of trust. Warmth was never free. Even in the beginning, it had to be earned, traded, maintained, negotiated through proximity. Archaeologists who study ancient hearths talk about ash deposits, like accountants discuss ledgers, how often the fire was fed, how close people sat, how long the embers lasted. Each circle of char tells the same story, that survival depended on an unspoken exchange of temperature. The first economy wasn't about food or tools, it was about degrees of heat. A body could be both furnace and investment. Sleeping closer to the center meant comfort. Sleeping at the edge meant frostbite. There's evidence from Paleolithic shelters showing warmth gradients, literally measurable temperature hierarchies, with charred bone concentrations thicker where people clustered most tightly. The strong or the dominant likely claimed the middle, leaving the rest to orbit around them like faint satellites. Warmth decided rank long before anyone carved symbols of power into stone. And it didn't take long for that exchange to become emotional. The same nervous system that flinched from cold learned to associate contact with safety. To touch was to survive. Neuroscientists say oxytocin and dopamine had their evolutionary debut around the same fires that once smoked our ancestors' lungs. The tenderness we now romanticize was, at first, just a clever biological bribe. nature's way of making codependence feel good, but calling it primitive misses the point. It was efficient. If one person drifted away, everyone else lost heat. That's the problem with warmth. It's contagious, but only if shared. And so, even the most solitary creature had to learn cooperation, not from idealism, but from thermodynamics. You might say the first law of civilization was simply, stay close, or stay dead. Over millennia, the habit refined itself into something softer, easier to disguise. Warmth became affection, affection became loyalty, and loyalty became a kind of moral temperature, the warmth of being trusted, of belonging. But beneath all that social embroidery, the old calculation still hummed quietly, the physics of skin, and it was in that persistent glow that something extraordinary began to happen. The body, once merely a radiator for survival, became a conduit for feeling. Heat started to mean more than just life. It meant connection, which is how temperature, of all things, gave birth to emotion itself. Somewhere between the shiver and the sigh, warmth stopped being a matter of physics and turned into something personal. It's hard to pinpoint when exactly it happened. There's no fossil record for tenderness, but the body tells on itself. The same nerves that once flared at the first lick of heat began to stir when another person touched you. Evolution didn't invent love, it just repurposed thermal comfort. When two bodies shared heat long enough, the brain started treating that temperature as safety itself. That's why even now, centuries of walls and blankets later, we still calm down when someone stands close. The nervous system can't tell the difference between affection and insulation. We talk about warmth as if it's moral, but really it's metabolic memory, the ghost of a world where closeness was survival. Archaeologists can see this shift buried in the smallest clues, the careful placement of paired burials, the remains of sleeping pits that fit two bodies instead of one, the faint indentation of ribs pressed together in fossilized soil. It's not poetry, it's evidence. Our species learned intimacy by accident, through friction, breath, and the uncomfortable discovery that dependence felt good. And once that link was made, the consequences were permanent. Warmth became shorthand for trust, cold for cruelty. Civilizations would later carve entire moral codes around these sensations, calling some hearts warm, others cold, as if virtue itself could be measured by body temperature. Even language followed suit. We warm up to people. We offer cold shoulders. We burn with desire. Our metaphors are just prehistoric campfire echoes, disguised as civility. But emotion, like heat, was never stable. It flickered. It demanded fuel. If you stopped feeding it, it dimmed into ash, which, perhaps inevitably, brought humanity back to where it began, sitting around a flame, learning to keep it alive, not with logs this time, but with attention. And in that faint circle of light, under smoke and starlight, people began to understand something new. The geometry of survival wasn't just physical anymore, it was social. At some point, warmth found a shape. It wasn't planned, more like an accident that worked too well to abandon a ring of bodies around a single flame. Fire had made its debut as a temperamental miracle, but its real gift was architectural. It organized the night. The first hearth wasn't just a heat source, it was geometry made holy. In the dark, circles meant fairness. Everyone could see the fire, and everyone could see everyone else. No one was behind or above. For a few thousand years, that illusion was enough. Archaeologists still find those arrangements, concentric rings of ash and tools, bone fragments radiating outward like ripples. It's the earliest known blueprint of togetherness. Around that fragile light, humanity rehearsed the concept of us. They told stories, they distributed tasks, they learned that silence could be shared without being hostile. The circle didn't just warm them, it taught them posture, attention, the choreography of belonging. And yet, it was never entirely safe. To sit in the circle meant exposure. Every expression was visible, every gesture recorded in flickering orange. It's not hard to imagine that the first self-conscious thought, that sudden, unbearable awareness of being observed, was born beside the fire. Someone laughed too loud, someone stared too long, someone sat too far back. The group noticed civilization's favorite pastime, judgment, had arrived. Still, the fire demanded unity. Its appetite was endless. It punished indifference. Someone always had to gather. Someone had to guard. Someone had to feed. Those roles solidified into rhythm, and rhythm, given enough repetition, became ritual. From that nightly maintenance of flame came the foundation of religion, of duty, of time itself. The circle also made the world smaller. Beyond its reach, darkness pressed in like an audience that never applauded. Inside, the smoke curled through human lungs and rewired memory. Smell became nostalgia, heat became home. The fire didn't just separate light from dark, it drew the first moral border between the known and the unknowable. But what made it truly radical was what happened when the flames dimmed. People didn't scatter, they leaned closer. They kept breathing in sync, kept existing within that same invisible radius of heat long after the fire was gone. The circle had done something irreversible. It made solitude feel like exile. And so, as the night deepened and the glow turned to embers, another kind of intimacy took shape, quieter, riskier, and far more revealing. Because to sleep beside someone in that half-light wasn't just to share warmth, it was to trust that your heart could keep beating in another's silence. Sleep was the first betrayal of vigilance. You could sharpen sticks, keep watch, chant to the sky all you wanted, but eventually your body would fold, eyes would close, and the world would have its chance. That helplessness demanded a new invention, trust, not the modern verbal kind that gets notarized and broken in court, but the quiet, physical version, the faith that the person breathing next to you wouldn't slit your throat before sunrise. It's strange how evolution cornered us into intimacy. To survive, you had to sleep. To sleep, you had to surrender. Anthropologists studying early shelters found groups curled so close their bones almost overlap, not for comfort, but for insurance. You can see it in the soot patterns on cave walls, the fire in the center, darker ash where bodies lay shoulder to shoulder, a faint clean ring where no one dared move. Breath was shared, literally recycled air. One exhalation became another's inhale. Safety was a closed loop. Even after fire tamed some of the terror, the risk didn't vanish. To rest meant to reveal weakness, an open throat, an unguarded chest. Every sleeping cluster was a temporary truce between hunger and fear. The group had to agree, wordlessly, that unconsciousness wouldn't be punished. That's the real beginning of morality, not commandments, not divine light, just the choice to let someone sleep beside you and wake up alive. Across cultures that still live close to the natural world, that primal etiquette remains. Among Arctic herders, rainforest dwellers, desert nomads, sleeping alone is still considered a curse. The night is too long, too cold, too crowded with unseen things. So they sleep in tangles, limbs intertwined, breaths overlapping. Scientists who record their heartbeats find something eerie. The rhythms synchronize. The body, it seems, still remembers how to belong. That shared stillness, that surrendering of vigilance, might be the oldest social contract in history. Civilization would later call it companionship, then love, then domestic peace. But back then, it was just physics again, disguised as grace. Two warm lungs trusting each other not to vanish in the dark. And that trust, fragile and physical, would soon shape something much bigger than survival. It would carve out hierarchy, obligation, and all the ways warmth could be given or withheld. Because where people slept together, someone was always closer to the fire than someone else. Equality never stood a chance, not even in sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the safer you were from cold, from animals, from the long fingers of the dark. Every hearth had its gravitational pull, and around it, warmth settled like privilege. Archaeologists can still read those invisible borders in the dirt, darker, compacted soil where bodies pressed together, lighter patches toward the edges where breath turned brittle and frost crept in. The pattern repeats itself across millennia, across continents, longhouses in Europe, shelters in Siberia, caves in Africa. The arrangement never changed much. The strong, the old, the important claimed the center. Children and subordinates orbited outward. The unlucky slept by the door, first to feel the draft, first to meet whatever crawled in from the dark. Heat was social currency. To be warm was to matter. What began as thermodynamics evolved into etiquette. The right to warmth became the right to authority. Those who controlled the fire decided who joined the circle. It was the earliest form of gatekeeping, literally, of gates and heat. A place by the fire wasn't just physical comfort. It was access to conversation, protection, and belonging. Step too far away, and you stopped existing. Anthropologists sometimes call this thermal hierarchy, though that sounds far too polite for what it was. Warmth drew the first invisible walls. It decided proximity, affection, and, eventually, inheritance. You can trace its descendants easily enough. The head of the table, the front of the room, the bed with the thicker blanket, each a quiet echo of those first nights when warmth meant worth. It's almost funny, the species that invented empathy by accident also used it to organize distance. The same hands that reached to share heat began to decide whose heat was worth keeping. And that's how something as gentle as warmth started building structures that would one day resemble class, marriage, and monarchy. But before it hardened into politics, warmth still had one redeeming trick left. It taught cooperation, not the kind written in treaties or laws, but the silent choreography of bodies adjusting to survive together. Those who couldn't share space didn't last. Those who could evolved. And in that strange intimacy, the press of shoulders, the steady hum of another's pulse, something unexpected began to bloom. Heat turned into habit, and habit into feeling. What started as an accident of temperature became something tender, almost sacred. The body learned to translate proximity into affection, which is where the story turns from physics to biology, when the warmth of skin began shaping not just survival, but the species itself. It's hard to exaggerate how much touch rewired the human animal. The simple act of not freezing together became a quiet revolution in biology. Every night, in those cramped shelters of fur and smoke, humanity rehearsed the future of empathy. To share heat meant tolerating movement, scent, sound, the entire sensory theater of another body. And over thousands of generations, that tolerance carved new grooves into the nervous system. Primatologists studying modern great apes often note that grooming isn't just hygiene, it's diplomacy. Our ancestors perfected the same trick, except they did it horizontally, half asleep, inside a nest of shared breath. Each twitch, sigh, and murmur reinforced an invisible social web. You learned the subtle grammar of trust, whose breathing calmed you, whose didn't. Sleep was a nightly referendum on belonging. Evolution rewarded those who could stay close without clawing at each other. People who tolerated proximity were the ones who lived long enough to have children. Cooperation, that golden myth of civilization, began under a pile of hides that smelled like wet fur and smoke. The ability to coexist in stillness, to let another heartbeat dictate your rhythm, became the species' superpower. Even the body shows its loyalty to that origin. Humans, unlike most mammals, retain a lifelong craving for skin contact. Infants who are touched thrive. Those who aren't wither. Adults still seek warmth in touch, even when technology offers easier comforts. We have thermostats now, but the body keeps demanding company. Our biology is ancient, stubborn, and embarrassingly sentimental. In a sense, every act of modern affection, holding hands, sleeping side by side, leaning close to whisper, is an archaeological echo, a fossilized instinct wrapped in civility. The brain can't tell the difference between emotional safety and shared temperature. It floods the bloodstream with the same chemicals either way, which is why comfort, even now, feels warm. And when the lights went out and people began to dream, this new emotional machinery didn't stop working. It simply changed worlds. Dreams became the nocturnal extension of social life, the shared hallucination of the tribe. Sleep turned from necessity into narrative, because once the body learned to rest together, the mind started to wander together too, weaving the night into something communal, something spoken about by morning smoke. When the eyes closed, the fire didn't stop flickering, it simply moved inward. Sleep wasn't private yet, it was a shared landscape. In the darkness behind their eyelids, people wandered through the same fears, the same noises, the same hunger, and by morning, those private visions became public property. Dreams were not secrets, they were reports. Around the rekindled embers, people compared what their minds had done overnight, as if the camp itself had kept dreaming through them. Anthropologists, studying present-day forager societies, still find traces of that logic. Among groups who sleep communally, dreams are discussed, like whether something everyone experienced, but from a slightly different angle. If one person dreamed of danger, it wasn't symbolic, it was a warning. If another dreamed of ancestors, it wasn't nostalgia, it was contact. The dream world was simply another form of communication, a night meeting where the body rested but the mind stayed social. That habit goes back farther than language itself. Early cave paintings, with their overlapping animals and shadowed silhouettes, may have been attempts to record those shared nightscapes. The line between myth and dream was blurry, probably non-existent. What we now call imagination was once collective memory, assembled from half-remembered flickers of sleep. And in this nightly exchange, humanity built its first moral vocabulary. If someone dreamed of betrayal, the group took note. If they dreamed of warmth, it was a blessing. Dreams regulated behavior, a subtle surveillance system where even unconscious thoughts had witnesses. Civilization began gossiping long before it began writing. Still, there was tenderness in that shared madness. To sit at dawn and listen to another recount their night, the wild symbols, the shivering metaphors, was an act of patience, maybe even affection. People learned to care about what haunted others. Empathy, you could argue, began as a morning ritual beside dying embers. But as communities grew and shelters solidified, the dream circle stretched thinner. The hearth's intimacy began to fracture. Families formed, then houses, then walls. And as warmth became more contained, so did imagination. The architecture of closeness, that fragile balance of heat, trust, and shared story, was about to change shape forever. The circle that once held the species together began to sprout corners. The hearth, once the gravitational center of every night, became a feature, an ornament tucked neatly inside a structure. When people started building walls, warmth stopped being a public event. It became domestic, then personal. The house replaced the fire, and the bed replaced the circle. Humanity had discovered privacy, and with it, the luxury of selective warmth. Archaeologists can trace this shift almost like a time-lapse of intimacy. In early longhouses, dozens of bodies slept in rows around a single flame. But by the Bronze Age, you start to see enclosed rooms, raised platforms, and the faint suggestion of boundaries. Warmth, once communal, now obeyed ownership. A bed wasn't just a place to rest. It was a symbol of autonomy, a small kingdom fenced by fabric and expectation. It's remarkable, really, how architecture taught emotion new manners. Walls didn't just trap heat, they trained people to curate presence. Inside them, silence acquired etiquette. The same closeness that had once been a survival mechanism became a choice, a privilege even. You could now decide who to share your body's temperature with. Affection became selective, ritualized, narratively convenient. But it wasn't without its ghosts. The body, as always, lagged behind invention. Even surrounded by stone and comfort, it still longed for the slow rhythm of another's breath. So families recreated it artificially. Beds large enough for children to pile in, pets allowed near the foot, lullabies humming like the old communal breath in miniature. We still designed warmth as a group project, even inside our separations. And the house itself began to mimic the old circle. The fireplace took its place at the center, glowing like a caged sun. Meals gathered around it, stories returned to it, and every family became a small reenactment of that ancient choreography of fire and flesh. But the symmetry was gone. Someone always slept closer to the heat. Someone always tended the flame. In this new geometry of belonging, warmth took on a subtler meaning. It wasn't survival anymore, it was devotion. To keep the house warm was to prove care, to sustain something invisible. The labor of warmth became love's quiet twin. And yet, with every generation, the circle kept shrinking. Eventually, all that remained of the fire was the couple, two bodies replacing the crowd, the species condensing into a private alliance of shared heat. The arrangement worked beautifully, until it didn't, because when warmth becomes exclusive, its absence begins to feel colder than ever. Warmth won. That was the problem. The long war against the cold ended, and humanity, as usual, didn't know what to do with victory. Central heating, insulation, double-glazed windows, all those small triumphs of comfort built the quietest catastrophe imaginable. We no longer needed each other to survive the night. The thermostat replaced the body. The home stayed warm, even when the people inside it didn't. Historians of domestic life like to describe this as progress, though they rarely mention what got lost in the upgrade. Once, the crackle of a shared fire kept the family breathing in rhythm. Now, machines hum in separate rooms, each person cocooned in perfect, isolated air. The architecture of survival has turned inward. You can live your whole life at a stable 22 degrees and never touch another person out of need. Biology, however, is terrible at forgetting. The nervous system still expects the warmth of skin, still calms at the sound of someone else's breath. Studies show that people who sleep beside another body, even without touching, drift more easily into deep rest. Heart rates sink, stress plummets. The body, nostalgic fool that it is, keeps searching for a fire that's long been extinguished. So we improvise. Candles, heated blankets, videos of crackling fires that burn forever but never change. We call it coziness, though it's closer to simulation. The rituals are the same, but the heat is artificial, like trying to hug a memory. Anthropologists have started calling this our post-thermal era, where warmth exists everywhere but means nothing. The temperature's right, the climate's wrong. Still, something ancient resists. We gather around glowing screens the way our ancestors gathered around flames, shoulders bent inward, faces lit by moving light, the air quiet, except for the flicker. The circle isn't gone, it just glows colder. We keep sitting there, pretending we're alone, when in truth we're just repeating the oldest gesture in history, waiting for the night to pass together. Because deep down, every human body still carries that prehistoric logic, the conviction that warmth isn't something you own, it's something that happens between pepins, and until we find our way back to that rhythm, the world will stay perfectly heated and quietly freezing.